First-person, beat-em-up, dungeon crawler. That may sound like a weird bunch of genres to put together, but this actually isn't the first time this idea was done. Well, the first two anyway. At this point, with the rise of roguelikes, people are aware of the more famous FPS dungeon crawlers, but I wanted to focus on beat-em-ups. To my knowledge, Neo Geo's Super Spy was the first to try this idea, but suffers from a lack of enemy variety and a hit detection that would make TF2 blush. Breakdown was a heaping pile of jank, and the constant shaky cam made me too nauseous to actually finish it. Xenoclash, however, stands out among the rest, with striking visuals, satisfying and meaty gameplay, and a generally good soundscape. Plus, it has the Shockmaster.
That trick with the bomb. You learned that from me, remember?
So you're the man that rules the world. They call me the Shockmaster.
But Xenoclash was the exception, and not the rule. So even with one pretty solid game, my opinion on the genre was lukewarm at best. Until that opinion got rocked in the jaw. At a glance, this looks like the love child of Legend of Grimrock and Punch-Out!, but instead of being Little Mac on a deserted island, you are
Fightknight.
and you've come seeking the mythical wish-granting tower, which has just been summoned by your rival Revali Rosencrantz. Those who scale the tower will inevitably make a pact with the cursed spire, trading their freedom for their deepest desire. So with that knowledge, why do you still climb? Simply for your own desires, or something else entirely? Questions for later. But one thing is clear. In a world of fantasy creatures and magical monsters, you're the muscle wizard with a mastery in casting fist. Also, when you interact with anything, you punch it. You are a silent protagonist after all. You don't do it out of anger, you're just introverted. But before we begin, there's a Jason Bourne themed elephant in the room. Being a brawler inspired by God Hand, it's plain to see how the first-person perspective could be a problem to someone who is motion sensitive, but where Breakdown failed, Fightknight prevails, and accessibility settings come in clutch. Things like camera movement, zoom, and sprite dithering are all settings that can be customized to your own tastes. Or you can just use presets. So if you have a weak stomach, the devs have your back. It's nice when games include features like this. Even if it's for the sake of immersion, the shaking can be a bit intense when the game starts to pick up. And I know people who can't play modern FPS games because the view bob makes them recreate that scene from Team America. I set mine to stream friendly, but if you want those crusty visuals, then go ahead. Also, there's no difficulty setting. There's only an option for game speed, and while I wouldn't recommend it, you could adjust this if you want an easier time. Now, despite me talking about Grimrock earlier, the whole dungeon crawling aspect was actually inspired by Atlas titles, mainly SMT and Darkspire. Comparing them side by side, you can see how the latter inspired the color for all the environments. At times, with the game's deep color palette and hand-drawn sketchy art style, it looks like a playable comic book. Some of the color choices even reminded me of Comic Zone in some places. And with the inclusion of dynamic lighting, the areas are visually interesting, despite having a very limited color palette. The game starts pretty grounded, with the dark maze-like aqueducts, complete with a minotaur. But, being a giant magical tower, every floor consists of all the different lands the cursed spire was summoned in before. This is how you can have a garbage-filled swamp on one floor, and right above it is a Japanese-infested active volcano. My favorite area is the 5th floor, not even just aesthetically, more just because it has many things to discover, things that I'll show the least in this video. Let's just say it made me pretty hungry. When exploring the tower, you'll inevitably get hit with a random encounter, which I can only describe as first-person Mega Man Battle Network, but instead of methodical deck building, you just beat the snot out of each other. Fighting is rather straightforward. Both you and the enemy occupy one of two lanes. One of the first things you'll notice is that the movement is grid-based, meaning that you can only move one square at a time. This may seem awkward at first, but given how some puzzles require precision, it's more intuitive than it seems. Fightknight can do a flurry of jabs, which gets faster the longer you pummel, or perform heavy attacks, and depending on where you move beforehand, you can follow it up with a hook, uppercut, or smash. Not moving at all lets you perform a straight that can even punch through guarding enemies. A simple, but dependable moveset. You can stunlock most early enemies by just jabbing them, but even on the first floor, you're given a good reason not to glue your face to someone like you're doing an MMA promo. Tapping your movement keys also functions as a dodge. This means you can dodge a guy in one lane and simultaneously wind up a punch meant for a sucker in the other lane. You can also block to reduce damage, but it wouldn't be a good character action game without a parry. To do so, you block just as an attack connects. Any and every attack can be parried with the right timing. You can even reflect projectiles. Most enemies, including ones in the back row, have audio cues right before they attack, which can be useful when deflecting bullets. Enemies telegraph their attacks before they swing, and only when they change color do you have to worry about an attack connecting with your face. And this is why the color of the enemies is so important. With all these color changes, at no point does it obscure the combat. Even the red enemies change to yellow before they attack. The perspective itself also makes it easier to deal with groups. Since everybody is in front of you, and because of the way movement works, it would have been pretty awkward if you had to face anyone behind you. There are times when enemies can mess up your timing. Fight an enemy long enough, or simply by random chance, you can fight angry enemies. These guys swing faster and hit harder, with the upside being that they take extra damage. The biggest issue is that you can't rely on a color change to tell when they are going to swing, since they're already red. Thankfully, the increased damage taken means that if you focus them, they won't last very long. And there's no better way to deal with difficult enemies than with the special bar, which lets you use your special menu. When activated, time slows to a crawl, and your selection of equipped special moves circles the screen. These moves include a barrage of punches that can tear through enemies if you mash hard enough, the 100-inch punch, which can launch enemies down a lane like a bowling ball, and even a Three Stooges routine, which can insta-kill any enemy in the game as long as they have eyes.
That ease, loser.
There are 9 of these in total, which you can learn through finding recipes across the various floors of the tower, which you can then give to your bar of BF for a nice home-cooked meal. Now you may be wondering how eating a hot Lebanese dinner made from various monster parts can give you the power to punch like Kenshiro. What's more important is that monster parts make your world go round. The remains of your enemies are your currency, your food, and even provide world building and insight into their past. The key takeaway from this is that Fightknight is the closest thing I'll ever get to a dungeon meshy video game. I just really hope the adaptation is good. Anyway, fisting isn't the only thing that's customizable. You can find various pieces of gear around the tower, bring them back to the draconic blacksmith for a snack, and he'll give you new armor. This all translates to modified versions of your base moveset, aka styles. Gambling Gunslinger. You have the fastest attacks in the game with almost no windup on anything. You can sprint forward to knock down enemies on a line, or strategically run away. The only downside is that you'll be killed by a stiff breeze. The Leather Manhandler, featuring the heaviest hitting moves in the game, with a large windup that's slower than the intro to this video, but you get thick. Charge your punches indefinitely while moving at the same time. You get the most health out of all the other armors, and you don't flinch against most normal enemies, letting you trade hits with ease. You even get access to my favorite uppercut in the game. And since specials aren't affected by what armor you're wearing, you can just piss everyone off intentionally, and then use your specials to capitalize on the bonus damage. I'd say they're all perfectly viable, and can be broken given the right circumstances. That's kinda my whole take on the overall gameplay loop in general, in regards to how much the game respects the player. It's real simple at the start. You start a floor, start kicking ass and taking names, but eventually you'll encounter that enemy. Something that requires you to think on your feet, and using what you know to adapt, encouraging experimentation. You can even get advice from June back in town, by giving her monster parts of the enemies you defeated. Either way, you'll have to fight the thing firsthand before you learn how to beat it, and at no point does it ever shove a tooltip in your face if you mess up. Fightknight undeniably takes cues from games like DMC3, both in your moveset and the enemies. You might stumble at first, but after you learn to respect the game, you won't just be climbing the dungeon, you'll be styling all over it. While sometimes the music can amp up the hype, other times the music can make places feel downright cozy. The contrast in music makes it nice to revisit the town in between floors. And it's not just the music, but also the people that inhabit this small town. You're gonna find a lot of colorful characters on your adventure. Not only can they help you inside the tower, most of them even have their own quest line. Now, I've barely talked about it, but this is a dungeon crawler with puzzles. And this is the one issue I see people having with this game. Not that the puzzles themselves are too difficult, but rather, while trying to solve said puzzles, the encounter rate can be a bit overwhelming. The combat is fast and satisfying, as it should be, but being interrupted for the 30th time while you're doing the Pokemon Ice puzzle can be a bit of a pain. This is the other use for monster parts. They can be used to make potions. Potions can solve a variety of issues that you might come across in the tower. Aside from basic healing, you get auto revive, defense and offensive potions, and even a potion that can slow down time. It can be pretty tedious to get halfway through a dungeon, and then be forced to trudge back to bed because you got jumped by the street sharks. If random encounters are the issue, you have options. Really, really good options. Before moving on, I highly encourage you to play this before watching this next part. So, if you want to experience this yourself without getting spoiled, go to here. Now, time for that wish. Huh. This is our wish maker, not some genie or giant talking head, it's a supercomputer, and it wants to know our wish. We give it the best answer we can. And it responds in kind. Man, we're 2 for 2 now, what the hell? Long ago, the machine was made by a race of beings so old that their names were lost to time. Its sole purpose was to grant wishes, and it did so without fail. But after fulfilling all their wishes, it realized that all wishes stem from the base desire for stability, peace, and an end to suffering, a collective directive. The machine believed itself to be without fault, and who could blame it? It did its job perfectly, and in the machine's perfect judgment, it sought to remove all that conflicted with the new directive. In one fell swoop, its creators ceased to be. Now alone, it thought, why only fulfill wishes once, when fulfillment could be continual? This wishmaker turned into a monkey's paw, and the machine evolved into the tower. No longer would it just need to heed the wishes of those who summoned it. The tower would dive into their hearts and bear the desires for all to see. Their wishes granted, but their own fulfillment just out of reach. A blessing to few, and a blatant curse to others. Within these walls, they would be edging for all eternity. But I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah, Rivali. Whatever. Despite summoning the damn thing, and what the intro cinematic would imply, both of you have been in a race to get to the summit, and you've just barely been tailing him. Only at the summit, Rivali explains why he's doing any of this in the first place. Prior to the events of the game, you were simply known as the Gladiator. You challenged the prince to a duel, and during the back and forth, you removed the prince's prosthetic arm. He proclaims that if he could not overcome any and every challenge, then his subjects would lose faith in him, and exposing his weakness, broke him. In his desperation, he pleaded for the tower to curse you for revealing his shame. You were then cursed to never be fit to wield a blade, as they violently explode in your hands, and the prince gets a new rocket hand, an arm for an arm. Regardless, even without a blade, you lay out the prince so hard that his theme song changes.
Why isn't this working?
Now I could go on about how thematically the prince parallels both the tower and its inhabitants, with him lusting for power as a way to hide his shame and the Fightknight being a foil to both, but what I find way more interesting is why you're even here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Fightknight uses his fists instead of actually talking, leading to some comedic moments because he's actually punching them. But also in a meta sense, mashing buttons to skip through dialogue is what players do all the time, especially on dialogue you've already seen before, which can translate to the Fightknight nudging them to get on with it. However, when talking to the prince, you barely punch him at all. This all comes to a head when, at his lowest, lamenting his failures, after you catch his rocket arm, you apologize by giving it back. You didn't come to the tower to lord over the prince's weakness, or have the magical tower grant you your wish. The whole reason you're here is because you wanted a rematch. But you've already fought the prince multiple times in the tower, so what gives? Now this is a theory, but bear with me. The tower was accurate enough when it said that the Fightknight loves bettering himself by fighting through adversity, but it misinterpreted your intentions. I believe all Fightknight wanted was to have a proper match with the prince, the same way that they did when they first met, by literally clashing swords, which sounds like some Yakuza 2 nonsense. If that's true, then Fightknight's a pretty cool dude. The dude's a beast in combat, but doesn't want to stick to just one style. He betters himself by learning different methods of fighting, and even challenges those who are perceived to be unbeatable. It's inspiring, but again, it's speculation. After defeating the prince's final form, he accepts that he was wrong and recognizes your apology. More than anything, this angers the tower, and it desperately tries to maintain its directive by asking your wish. After this whole game, the only wish you have is to see the tower in pieces. With no other option, the tower itself now has to deal with you personally.
son. That's power.
This game is awesome. It's simple, but when you get into the swing of things, it's straight up addicting. Given my history with these sorts of games, if the Super Best Friends didn't play this way back in 2017, I don't think I would have even heard of it. What started out as some dude showing his friends some drawings, blossomed into one of the best premises I've heard for a character action game. And if you want more Fightknight, you can get back in the ring for round 2. Think like the Souls series New Game Plus. I've only beaten up to round 2, which offers slightly different boss encounters and new things to discover, but just like Souls, it can go way beyond just round 2. Fightknight is an easy recommendation if you like short but sweet action games about punching really hard. You can get this game on Steam for just $20, and if you like the game, please leave a good review. You can even follow them on Twitter if that's your thing. Sorcerobe needs way more love, man. I can't get over how slept on this game is. In summary, we need more games inspired by God Hand. Alright, this one took a bit longer than anticipated, but I'm glad you saw this through to the end. If you liked it, hit all the buttons. And if you didn't, tell me in the comments. I have a few ideas for the next video, but I'm open to suggestions. Hopefully, I'll see you soon.